Welcome back, everybody. And what you just experienced was one of the wonderful songs from Muzology, and our featured speaker, Dr. Lana Israel, will be telling us about her efforts at Muzology. A big theme of this conference has been sort of the value of collaborations between scientists, science communicators, science educators, and musicians and music people. Lana sort of embodies that in one person. She's had a career both as a academics person with her PhD from Oxford in experimental psychology, working in the domain of learning and cognition, and also has worked in the top levels of the music industry with Garth Brooks, and founding Muzology with Bob Doyle's, Garth's longtime manager. Lana, also dear to my heart as a statistician, has done data science work as doing analytics for the music industry. So I think that's pretty cool. And also, it's kind of neat that she follows Tracy, who is working in that space of middle school kids, where Lana's doing great work. And we'll see something about her featured talk, Love and First Sound When Math Meets Music, the title of her Muzology's recently released album. And take it away, Lana.
Thank you so much, Dennis and Larry, for having me join you all today. It's an honor and a real pleasure to be here, and very excited to share the work we're doing at Muzology. Precisely as you said, Dennis, Muzology is very much sits at the convergence of cognitive psychology and learning science, the mainstream music industry, and then data science. So it's very exciting to be able to combine all of those areas into a high impact solution that, quite frankly, is changing the lives of students. So I will share my screen. So as just stated, Muzology is a supplemental learning platform that combines cognitive science and music to supercharge learning for students of all backgrounds and abilities. And we are delighted to have received support from the National Science Foundation and the U.S. Department of Education through a series of R&D grants that has enabled us to continue to develop the Museology platform, and also engage in R&D to help, as Tracy was actually mentioning in her presentation, also bring students into the driver's seat and help them become creators as well. But let's look at why we started Muzology. And this is something that all of us in this conference and all of us right now understand, which is the power of music. So we know that music excites our brains and makes us sponges for information. And that is something we've experienced as babies and toddlers, from our ABCs to lullabies about twinkling stars. We had our curiosity sparked through the power of music. And without much effort, we actually learned and still remember our native alphabets, largely through music and song. We learned our animal songs on Old MacDonald's farm. So the idea of using music in the context of learning, it's quite pervasive and universal. As Tracy also pointed out, it tends to be limited to early childhood learning, where, quite frankly, it's saturated. Now, the neuroscience behind music tells us that music acts on the brain in a really powerful way that doesn't stop once we reach middle school, right? Music directly stimulates brain regions that are critical for successful learning, namely attention, memory, motivation, and emotion. And if you speak to educators about the greatest challenges they face in the classroom, that's your short list right there. So in music, we've got this really powerful medium that for an educator really fires on all cylinders. And understanding this, what we set out to do at Muzology was to take the power of music and bring it to an older demographic in a more sophisticated manner. So we assembled a team of hit songwriters and music producers and learning experts to create a music-based immersive digital learning solution. And so through a series of iterative instructional music videos, we teach critical pre-algebra and algebra readiness curriculum. So when we looked at the K through 12 landscape, what we found is you do see music being used occasionally, but it's as a one-off, almost novelty. And many of us remember Conjunction Junction or Being a Bill on Capitol Hill. But again, when we see music being used, it's like a one-off song here and there. For an educator who wants to use music in a more systematic way, as a really credible pedagogical tool, they're hard pressed to do so without, scouring the web and maybe finding a song here and a video here, or trying to create music-based learning content themselves. So what we said is, let's do that heavy lifting for an educator and create high production value, MTV quality music videos that teach critical curriculum and content. And let's make this plug and play for a teacher where these videos are mapped to standards. And so for an educator, they log into Muzology, hit the Muzology library, and see a series of music videos that map to their standards and pacing. And so when we designed the Museology platform, what we wanted to do was scientifically utilize the learning power of music, teach using instructional music videos. But something else that was really important to us was to be able to demonstrate that we can use music in the context of learning in a manner that transcends rote memorization. So a criticism, for lack of a better word, that we often hear from educators when you talk about the context of bringing music into learning, particularly math, is, hey, we're trying to move away from rote memorization. We're looking for tools that actually facilitate understanding and learning at a more deep and conceptual level. And so we wanted to dispel the pretty long-standing belief that, hey, when you use music to learn, it's got to be rote memorization. And so it was very important to us that we could demonstrate that we could use music-based learning to teach aspects of math conceptually as well as procedurally. And I would say probably 5% of our entire music-based learning catalog involves just straight up rote memorization. So that was something that was really exciting to be able to demonstrate. And then also, as Tracy had mentioned, what we set out to do was to create a high engagement experience for a preteen and teen demographic, because exactly as she said, what happens is once those kids reach 4th, 5th, 6th grade, and you're showing them music-based content that sounds like babies' music or kids' music, you get pushback right away. And so the idea was, let's meet students where they live and create music that sounds relevant and contemporary to them. So we assembled an amazing team of #1 hit songwriters, Grammy award-winning music producers, cognitive psychologists, math specialists, to again create these really high production value, MTV quality music videos that sequentially got students algebra ready. And the reason we started with pre-algebra was really twofold. One was when we looked at K-12, it really leaped off the page as a really acute pain point. It's when we see proficiency in math really drop. It's the first time systematically we see girls underperforming boys. We see disproportionate underperformance when we look at minority students. And it's when the math becomes more challenging and more sophisticated. So we felt like if we could apply music-based learning to a really, really big pain point in K-12 education, that's where we wanted to begin. Pre-algebra is also directly linked to high school graduation rates, college and career readiness. So it's very much a high stakes subject with not a lot of compelling solutions that are supplemental tools and solutions that are truly moving the needle at scale. Second reason we started with pre-algebra was we wanted to demonstrate that we could use music to teach more technical content and curriculum. So if we could instantiate music as a credible pedagogical tool in the context of something like pre-algebra, which again starts to get a little bit more sophisticated, then by extension, we can use music to teach almost anything. So the Museology platform is a robust learning system. It consists of a library of multimodal, iterative math music videos. And so as you could see in the video that was playing Graphing Ordered Pairs right before I began, there's a visual, auditory, and kinesthetic quality to our videos. And so we'll have teachers say students are taking a test and they see them mouthing the words to the song, or they actually see them doing the movements and the motions, kind of dancing in their seats to help pull the information back. We've actually had students say, I'm taking the test and I can't remember, and I do the dance moves and the information comes back to me. So the multimodal nature of the Museology experience is core and critical to it. And so for students, they're able to, through music, encode information simultaneously using different modalities. The Museology platform also consists of pre and post-test assessments. These are gamified in-platform formative assessments. So students answer warm-up questions to unlock a music video that primes the student for what they're about to learn, provides a gross baseline measure for the educator as to where the student began on a particular skill. And it also activates pre-existing knowledge. Then we encourage kids to come into the platform and watch a music video 3 times in a row on first view. And that's because, or in first exposure rather, and that's because students attend to different things progressively as they watch a music video again and again. The first time, they attend to a lot of the novelty features. So do I like the song? Who's singing? How are they dancing? What are they wearing? So more high level reacting to the creative side of the video. The second view is when all of that novelty they've been exposed to, and now they start to really clue into, okay, what are the main ideas being communicated? And on the third view is when a student really starts to pick up more of the detail. And that's the way we all learn the lyrics to songs. And quite frankly, that's the way we all learn anything, through rehearsal and repetition. When we hear a song on the radio, we don't necessarily know all the words to that song the first time we hear it. It's through repeated exposure to the song that suddenly we find ourselves singing along and going like, oh, I know all the words to this. I don't even know how I learned it. And that's almost like the magic of music, that if during this presentation, I was playing a song in the background on repeat again and again and again, you'd probably walk away from the Zoom singing some of those words to that song without intentionally even trying to learn the information. And so, a lot of people talk about a shift from passive to active learning. With music, I talk about a shift from active to intra-active learning, which is inside of the brain. It's just the way our brains are built and the way music exists. When you put them together, the information sticks almost without trying, right? That we just remember the information. Museology also consists of a playlisting feature. So that's where a teacher can create a custom playlist and assign it to an entire class, groups of students, individual students. And this enables a teacher to allow students to work through Museology in a manner that maps to their individual strengths or weaknesses, and also in a manner that coincides with that educator's curriculum and pacing. It also is a very easy way to support differentiated instruction. And also it's a very effective tool, whether we're learning in class or remotely. So we had a lot of teachers say during the pandemic, when they were teaching remotely or in a hybrid environment, that Museology was the only resource that their kids would actually do. And it saved them because they were able to create these playlists and assign them to students to enable them to continue learning at their own pace. And finally, the platform consists of dashboards and analytics, where teachers can look at progress by class, by individual student, and students can also track their own individual progress and learning growth. So the power of music-based learning really can't be understated And probably the best example of precisely how powerful music-based learning was last year during the pandemic. We know the stats and the data, and they're the same all around the world, that there was significant learning loss. And so we see one such study from McKinsey and Company here, where, on average, overall, students lost about 10 months of learning. We've spoken to administrators at state departments of education. They're coming back to us and saying, last year was the first time we saw double-digit losses on state tests and benchmark testing that was conducted. And that learning loss tended to be about 2 times more pronounced for math than other subjects. Okay, so the counterpoint to that, which was a pretty universal phenomenon that we all get what happened, the counterpoint to that is these 2 teachers on the screen right here. So one teacher in Little Rock, Arkansas, her students last year during the pandemic, using Muzology consistently, showed on average 2 years of learning growth on a nationally benchmarked state test that they took. We had another teacher in California, more anecdotally than this teacher who saw these types of findings class-wide, but with an individual student who was struggling and used Muzology consistently for 3 months, saw a 50-point increase on a state test administered to her. So what we start to see with music-based learning is kind of the rules of engagement change and the outcomes change when we're able to use such a powerful learning modality. And when we get to some of the data, we're going to see that theme again and again and again. Some longstanding beliefs we've had and been taught about how the brain works and memory works and how learning works, kind of disproven once music-based learning enters the picture. Just a little bit of background on me and what brought me to start Muzology. I actually began working in the learning space at 13 years old. That's when I wrote my first book on learning, based on my 8th grade science project. And I was invited to present my research at a conference in Sydney, Australia. And in preparation for that conference, I wrote a short book on learning called Brain Power for Kids. And within a couple of weeks, I had a book publishing deal in Australia and New Zealand, and returned back to the States. I grew up in Miami and started to get invitations as a 13-year-old to 14-year-old to lecture throughout South Florida. And within months, I was lecturing throughout the country and then globally, and wound up self-publishing the book in the States, and it was translated into some other languages. And then I wrote a book applying the same learning technique to math. So I had my first career as a teenager working in the learning space in a very, very applied way. And then when I got to college and grad school was when I got introduced to the theoretical underpinnings of memory and cognition. And so it was very exciting to start to dig into the why of learning and memory. And after doing a postdoc at Oxford, where I did my doctoral work, I joked that I had an early life crisis and decided to leave academia and pursue another childhood passion of mine, which is music. I was crazy about music as a child and started writing music at 10. And so I packed up, moved to Manhattan, started working as the assistant to a music producer. And within 6 months, he had a big #1 hit with a very popular artist at the time, Jessica Simpson. And so as a result, his business just took off. And so I went from being his assistant to helping him run the company, and found myself squarely in the middle of the mainstream music industry. And it was at that time that it occurred to me, as essentially a former memory researcher, just how powerful music is, not just as an entertainment medium, but actually as a mechanism for learning. So what I realized is, in the academic and educational space, when we're assessing a new intervention, there are 3 things we look for. 1, is it replicable? 2, systematically, do we understand why we're getting the effect? And then 3, what's the size of the effect? So what occurred to me working in the music industry is we'd have these really great songwriters come into our studio, say 10 o'clock in the morning, and hours later, a song existed that didn't exist that morning. And if an artist decided to record that song and it got released at radio and it got played again and again and again and again, suddenly millions of people would know all the words to this song that maybe a month ago didn't even exist. So I was like, wow, this is definitely replicable, and it's quite a phenomenon. Like, that's pretty amazing when we look at learning. And then I thought, okay, well, systematically, do we know why we're getting the effect? And we just saw some of the neuroscience behind music-based learning. Now, we still don't understand exactly how music acts on the brain the way it does, but we know that music does act on the brain. We know that it acts on the brain and on brain regions that are critical for sustained and successful learning. So theoretically, we understand why we're getting this effect. And then I started to think about, well, what's the size of the effect? And this is in a very unscientific way, but just doing a little thought experiment. I realized that for most of us, if we hear a song that we really liked as a kid, decades later, if we hadn't heard it for 10, 20, even 30 years, suddenly all the words come back to us. And I don't know really any other medium or modality at scale that works that powerfully. I mean, that's a really outrageous learning effect, that you could be exposed to some sort of stimulus that you hadn't been exposed to for decades and recall information verbatim. So that's when I got kind of obsessed with this idea of how do we start working with music and positioning it not just as this incredible entertainment medium, but as a very powerful learning medium. So we started Muzology with a small scale randomized control trial. And we had a control group that watched 3 music videos with talent conversationally presenting the information with graphic overlays. And then we had the same talent present the same information in song form in the Muzology condition with the same graphic overlay. So we really controlled for song or no song. Every exposure to the videos, everything else was held constant within and between conditions. And so students were randomly assigned to a Muzology or control group after taking a comprehensive pretest diagnostic. And then after very minimal exposure to either set of the music videos, there was a 3-day delay at which time students received a surprise comprehensive post-test. And then 7 days later, they received another surprise comprehensive post-test. So as you can see here in the graph or the chart, after the 3-day delay, we see a statistically significant interaction and outperformance by the Muzology group versus the control group. However, the really, really interesting finding is what happened 7 days later. So this experiment falls pretty squarely into a body of research called recall after learning studies, which show pretty consistently if someone is exposed to new information and they haven't had enough rehearsal or repetition, thus exposure to it, for it to transfer into long-term memory, and then you remove their exposure to that material or information, you typically see a spike in retention in the day to 3 days after last exposure, where it's believed that the brain's consolidating the information. And then after about 72 hours, without fail, you typically see a drop in retention. So that's exactly, I mean, textbook what we see in the control group. But what's not textbook is what we see in the Muzology group, is that 7 days later, where just the expectation and the science is that we see this drop in retention, we see a horizontal line in the Muzology condition where students maintain their learning gains. So we see music at this 1 week delay driving sustained learning. What's so important about this is when the student's teacher saw the results of this study, he said, this is like I teach my something students this week, and next week they've already forgotten it. And pretty much every teacher out there can echo that sentiment because they've experienced it. So first instance of how empirically we're seeing the power of music actually fly in the face of some beliefs proven, let's say, beliefs and assumptions that, let's say, is based on data and evidence and science about how we think learning and memory work. So the next study I'd like to share is a summer school pilot. So the RCT we conducted with 60 students. Again, it was a small scale RCT. This summer school pilot we conducted with 300 students. So what you see here is a distribution of scores on a pretest before students watch a Muzology video. And so these were students who had essentially failed 8th grade math. And the histogram's reflective of that. You could see it's essentially a normal distribution with a tail towards the higher performing scores. What's notable here is the center of the distribution. The mode is a 30%. So these kids aren't kind of not getting it, they're really not getting it. So I would like you to venture to guess what happens the first time students post-test after watching a Muzology math music video. And feel free to share your guesses in the chat. Okay, so the mode's a 30%, the most frequently occurring score when they pretest is a 30. After watching a Muzology music video, just if people in the chat want to guess, what do you think the mode becomes? And then I'm going to show you. Okay, let you put some guesses in. And now I'm going to layer on. Okay, so the mode becomes 100%. Now, not only is that remarkable, but let's look at this blue distribution. Guess what? It's no longer a bell-shaped curve, right? So what we've been taught in every statistics and psychometrics course ever is that like all distributed human traits and characteristics are characterized by a bell-shaped curve, whether we're talking about IQ scores or height or standardized test scores. There's always a bell-shaped curve, except not now when we bring music-based learning into the picture. So here again, we see a finding that really kind of flies in the face of how we've been taught learning and memory should work at scale across the population. And may I add, we've replicated this finding. This is, of course, summer school. We've replicated this finding summer school throughout the course of the normal academic year in every state district school classroom that has used Muzology, whether they are intervention classes or honors classes. We've replicated this same finding. A bell-shaped curve turns into this asymptotic distribution, and the mode jumps from anywhere from a 30, a 40, a 50, depending upon where those kind of students are in their in the learning continuum, but the mode usually centers around 30, 40, 50, and then jumps to 100% after exposure to a Muzology video. Finally, I wanted to just share some data from a district diagnostic. So this is a comprehensive district diagnostic where we see students essentially, this is also a group of summer school students, a couple hundred summer school students. So we see 3% of those students pass the district diagnostic at the beginning of the summer. And 4 weeks later, after using Muzology, we see 1 in 3 students pass the diagnostic. Of course, this is all correlative data, but a trend and an outcome that really teachers had never seen before in their teaching experience. And so we'd like to be able to attribute some of this great growth to the fact that students were using Muzology that summer. Finally, what I wanted to share before we take questions is some feedback from teachers and students, our fans, we'd like to say. So I love this quote from this educator. It's one of the best resources I have. I've been teaching for 25 years. It's like when I grew up on Schoolhouse Rock, but on steroids. And anytime we're compared to Schoolhouse Rock, that is a great honor for us because we are big fans of Schoolhouse Rock, who demonstrated decades ago how powerful music can be in the context of learning. And this student quote is so important. I was failing. I feel so proud of myself now. I've never felt that feeling of getting 100% on my tests. We hear a lot of dialogue right now about the increased importance of social emotional learning, and it's very, very important. With Muzology, I feel like we are affecting something called cognitive emotional learning. And so what happens is for a lot of students, many of whom have never experienced academic success, particularly in math before, they suffer from a lot of limiting beliefs. We've had students say things to us like, I'm dumb, I hate math, I don't care about algebra, I don't want to go to college. Weeks later, after using Muzology, we have the same kid saying, I love math, it's now my favorite subject. I can't wait to take algebra. I want to go to college and become an electrical engineer. Muzology has not just given me confidence in my ability to do math, it's given me confidence in my ability to do anything. And so imagine these students, they're stuck in these negative self-reinforcing feedback loops where somewhere, or usually early in their learning experience, whether it came from peers or, believe it or not, family or teachers, they internalize this belief that they're dumb and math is hard. And so what happens is they kind of check out. So they stop applying themselves, they stop studying, they continue to do poorly in math. And so they're stuck in this spiral where they continue to get confirmatory evidence that they're dumb and math is hard. And then we introduce music-based learning to them. And they're like, what's this, a music video to learn math? And it draws them in. And then you saw the pre and post test scores. Suddenly these kids are going, I got an 80 or a 90 or 100. This is disconfirmatory evidence. It does not fit in this worldview of I'm dumb, math is hard. So now what these kids do is they get drawn in even more. They go, I'm going to watch another video. I'm going to take another challenge. I'm going to continue to do this. And suddenly this feedback loop gets stopped in its tracks, starts spiraling around this way. Suddenly these kids start to go, I can do math. I do have efficacy as a learner. It feels good to learn and achieve. And so we've had teachers say, once they start using Muzology, just when they're not using the platform, just during traditional instruction, students are paying more attention. They're telling other students to be quiet. They want to hear what their teacher's saying. And so it's really a transformative experience for so many students. The reason I'm saying this is cognitive emotional learning is these students have a cognitive experience that then shifts something for them and leads to this very deep psychological and emotional transformation that, as you know, when you get to middle school and high school students, kind of telling them about a concept or idea or a notion that doesn't fit into their worldview or that they don't have experience of, it's tricky, it's harder. But when they're able to actually experience these breakthroughs themselves, we just see remarkable things happen for students. And so here again lies the really amazing power of music. Music-based learning is something that doesn't only drive amazing academic outcomes, but also really, really profound emotional and psychological really transformations for students around the country and around the world, as well as their teachers and as well as their communities. So thank you all so much. It's been really exciting to be here with you. And if we have some time for questions, I'd love to answer them.
We do. Thank you very much, Lana. That was really terrific. One of the things I was kind of wondering is because your initial motivation was the idea that music lets you say, remember 2 decades later how you do the alphabet and so forth. And so obviously the holy grail in educational studies is that long-term retention. Are they able to apply the material as prerequisites in the next level and things like that? So I'm wondering, have you done enough for long enough to have been able to do any retention studies?
Yeah, we unfortunately we haven't in terms of real longitudinal data. We haven't been around long enough to do that. A challenge as well in the space is accessing third-party data, as you may know. So they're only like a couple of districts that we've been in long enough to start to look at things longitudinally. And then the question is like, we want to look at that with third-party benchmarks, not just our own in-platform assessments. Quite frankly, those kids may have come in and out of Museology at the years later. And so the challenge has been accessing that, but it's just happened to turn out in those districts. There were some challenges that went on with the state test, which was essentially their proxy for learning progress and growth in this initial Museology timeframe as well. And then of course, we know the data would be pretty skewed over the last year and a half, given extenuating circumstances. So unfortunately, we don't yet have that longitudinal data, but to your point, that absolutely would be an incredibly powerful view into the efficacy of music-based learning more long-term. Absolutely.
Question came in here from Walter Smith. Very, very impressive results. A question. I would expect pushback from students about the requirement to watch the video 3 times in a row. Does such pushback happen much? Have you thought about mitigation strategies, such as some kind of gamified quiz in between each viewing, or is the immediate repetition really critical to the learning?
So we, in the actual platform, we don't force students to watch a video 3 times in a row. They have complete autonomy over how they more or less drive, right? So they can watch the video once and start taking the challenges. It's our best practice recommendation is that they watch the video 3 times in a row. In the context of controlled testing, like when it's less naturalistic and we're actually conducting an experiment, we kind of force that behavior. And to your point, students can find it a little tedious doing that if it's in one sitting. But for like, so in that RCT, that was the methodology that students were exposed to each new video, and they did watch it 3 times in a row. In the second and third study, you saw that wasn't a requirement. So that's a best practice recommendation we suggest with teachers. And the way we suggest that implementation is usually that a teacher starts by playing a video at the class level. So there's the first view. And then once the video is watched at the class level, and after watching the video, certainly students and teachers can have a discussion about it. Then when students log into their individual Museology accounts, they're encouraged to watch the video again. That's usually the second view. And we then see students will jump into the challenges and they'll go back and watch the video if they find that they're struggling with the challenges. So they kind of self-police themselves and work through the system in a way that meets their needs.
A question from Susie Shrub. Have you considered looking at studies into dementia patients and music lyric retentions to support the understanding about how music is such a powerful learning tool? Would that be a useful thing to do?
Absolutely. That's an area that I'm personally very interested in, and I hope to be able to study more formally and even develop some music-based solutions in the future for that demographic. I mean, I think as the question suggests, we anecdotally know lots of instances of patients with dementia or Alzheimer's who can't remember their children's name, but know all the lyrics to songs they heard as children. Those are very, very powerful anecdotes that suggest that music is somehow processed in a way in the brain such that access to that information is kind of still spared and available and accessible, whereas access to other information is not. And starts to suggest that information encoded using music somehow gets processed more robustly or differently, or using more different brain regions than information not encoded using music. So I think it is an incredibly interesting and fruitful and important area to research. We haven't done much in that area yet, but I'd very much like to do so in the future.
You had talked before about sort of the level above rote learning and so forth. Question about what meanings and understandings do students using Muzology construct, and what is your evidence base for those meanings beyond skill performance?
That's a great question. Right now, I mean, our primary measure is skill performance in terms of what we're measuring inside of the classroom, and if schools and districts are able to share third-party test data with us. Anecdotally, we hear of a lot of amazing things going on. So, we hear teachers saying to us, kids are learning the information at a deeper level than they've learned it before. Kids are collaborating with one another using the platform and assisting one another with math learning, something they'd never seen happen before. There was a really quite a cute example a teacher shared with us of one of the star football players who was in her class, and another student who she said was very quiet, and he was really small for his age. And she had them working on Muzology together, and the smaller young man helped teach this football player mathematical skills using Muzology. And she said suddenly she saw them walking down the hall, high-fiving each other. And so it's really neat to see what happens for kids when they feel like agents of their own learning and empowered to learn. We, again, anecdotally, we hear of teachers talking about, like, once students have these types of breakthroughs in Muzology, how they go on to excel more broadly in math class, and also assume leadership positions in the school. So there are a lot of these byproducts that occur in terms of the question, kind of depth of conceptual understanding and this depth of understanding. Unfortunately, we don't currently have a solid metric for that.
I think motivation, anxiety, confidence building, all those great things that you're getting testimony about would be very important to have some convincing evidence that you can relay, because that goes beyond just pre-algebra. I mean, it benefits their education in so many other ways.
Absolutely.
Larry, you had a question?
Yeah. So it makes total sense that you started with your focus on the pre-algebra curriculum and everything. I'm curious if you plan to go through, the rest of the vertical sequence of math, and also how you think your process would be any different if you were to do something with science education, since we have all STEM disciplines at this conference. And when you mentioned that learning loss was much higher for math students, I found myself curious why. Do you happen to know why?
I mean, I don't know why. My response would be conjecture. But math tends to be a more just kind of generally a more challenging subject for students than other subjects. I mean, typically we see kind of just outside of the pandemic, kind of lower proficiency in math compared to other subjects. So I think that just got exaggerated. In terms of your question as to the math vertical, interestingly, we are sticking with the math vertical right now, but we're going down, not up. So we're in the process of building out 3rd, 4th, 5th grade math. And to the question you had just asked, Dennis, we are focusing really strongly on conceptual understanding and mathematical reasoning with the elementary school content. So we're actually, we're making some interesting modifications to our methodology and approach to enable that to happen. But I think the outcome is going to be pretty awesome because while our current set of videos does focus on more of the procedural algorithmic side to math and fluency with a little bit of conceptual understanding, we're kind of flipping that, and we're kind of going all in on the conceptual side to start to teach students when they're first encountering these ideas, the underlying concepts, and how to kind of think about math a certain way, which we hope can be pretty groundbreaking. And so by the time these kids get to middle school, having those concepts down could be a real game changer. In terms of application to science, we've done a few proof of concept videos with science. The methodology seems to translate pretty well to science. Like anything, when we get into a new topic, or even right now with it, like a new demographic, we do some R&D and some testing. But I think science is a really kind of seamless transition for us once we've completed the math vertical.
Since you're mainly working with at the district level rather than just signing up individual teachers, that implies that you have some kind of program for professional development of the teachers in those districts, or how do you approach that?
So we do work with we work with districts, we work with schools, we work with individual teachers as well. Interestingly, we have some of our highest engagement teachers with amazing outcomes have done no professional development with us. We designed the platform to be very intuitive and allow for a lot of flexibility for the educator and the students. However, we do offer pre-COVID in-person or web-based professional development, which is now web-based. And in anywhere from 30 to 90 minutes, we're able to take educators through the platform, discuss best practices with them, provide implementation tips. So the good news is it's a pretty easy platform to be able to use and integrate into the classroom.
One of the things you mentioned early on was that middle school is where you see the unusual circumstance that girls fall below the boys in the math side. Is that something that changed post using Muzology?
You know, that's a great question. We haven't, so we don't have that data to be able to kind of bifurcate our data along those lines.
So all your web-based analytics are basically anonymous, and you don't have any ability
to all
to
be identified. Yeah, so, right. So I mean, all we know is essentially, you know, the student, the school they're at, and school and class, but we don't know anything more about the student. So unfortunately, you know, we're not able to parse the data that way.
Do we have any further questions? One thing you mentioned in the with respect to your summer program was the increase to about 1/3 of the students passing. But you had mentioned before, was that that was at the summer before when you were talking about the 3% rate?
that
There was
was
still
the-
students that had taken the summer program though.
That's right. It was the beginning of the summer versus the end of the summer.
Oh,
And that's a 4 to 5 week summer program.
versus other summer programs that go 4 to 5 weeks that aren't music related?
So that was like a within participants design where, so those students pre-tested at the beginning of the summer and post-tested at the end of the summer. What we know from their teachers is those types of gains are kind of unheard of for them in the context of a 4 to 5 week summer school program. In fact, in teacher training, sadly, what they were told is, hey, we don't expect any of these students to really go from failing to passing, but do your best. I mean, that was indicative of the type of results they had seen historically over the summer. Was not much of a change in pass rates from the beginning to the end of the summer.
Okay, thank you very much. Really exciting work. Look forward as the stuff progresses and you get this longer term data and so forth. It'll be really great to follow your work. So
Absolutely. Thank you.
thank you.